Welcome back to the deep dive. We take a whole stack of sources, articles, research, you name it, and basically pull out the most important bits for you. Think of it as your shortcut to, well, getting really well informed, maybe some surprising facts, a little bit of humor, hopefully enough to keep you listening.
Yeah, exactly.
Today, we're grabbing hold of a phrase, a maxim. You've definitely heard it. I bet you've probably used it yourself.
Absolutely.
And you've quite possibly profoundly misunderstood it. It's one of those phrases that seems so simple, right? So obvious, but its true meaning, it's got layers, artistic, philosophical, even technical depth that honestly most people just miss entirely.
Indeed. We were talking about form follows function. It sounds so, well, straightforward, almost like a command from an instruction manual, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Stark utilitarian. But as we're going to find out, especially when you look at it through the eyes of the guy who actually coined it, the visionary architect Louis Sullivan, well, the intent was far richer, more poetic, actually, and much more profound than the sort of bare bones interpretation it often got, or the rigid dogma it sometimes became later on.
Absolutely. So our mission today for this deep dive is to really get into one of architecture's most iconic statements. I mean, this phrase practically defined an era, and, it still shapes the world we build around us.
It really does.
We're going straight to the source, to the mind of Louis Sullivan. He's often called the father of skyscrapers, which is huge in itself, but also, crucially, he was the mentor to Frank Lloyd Wright.
Mm-hmm. Can't forget that connection.
Yeah, and you see, this isn't just about, debunking a common myth. It's about peeling back the layers, finding the philosophy underneath. A philosophy that really champions honesty, organic expression, and what Sullivan himself called beautifully, I think, the efflorescence of a building's soul. It's very soul.
Right. Our mission today is to unpack what Sullivan truly meant by form ever follows function. Notice that word, ever. It's not just form follows function.
Oh, good point.
Ever. Yeah. We'll look at where it came from, trace how it got, well, misinterpreted through history, and then show why Sullivan's original idea. It's still an incredibly powerful and relevant guide for authentic architecture, for real design, even now. It's about getting past the slogan, grasping a fundamental truth.
And to do that, we've pulled together a really fascinating stack of stuff for this deep dive. We've got historical architectural texts, biographies getting into the minds of the masters, and even some, cutting-edge modern construction management guides.
A real mix.
Totally. We'll be jumping from, say, the structural critiques of Viollet-le-Duc in France, back to the design choices of Palladio in Renaissance Italy, then shooting forward to the really complex demands of green building today, digital fabrication, how projects actually get delivered now. It's going to be a journey, really, across centuries, all to see how this one idea, this principle, has echoed or evolved and, yeah, sometimes been deliberately twisted. Okay. Let's dig in.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. With the man himself, Louis Sullivan. He wasn't just drawing buildings, he was a deep thinker, almost a philosopher of, the built environment.
He really was.
And his early life, especially his time at MIT, studying architecture. It gives us a glimpse into what shaped his really unique way of seeing things. He talked about experiencing a materialistic clarification of intellect during those years.
Interesting phrase. Isn't it? It suggests this period where pure reason, scientific thinking, was really taking over, almost, he said, eclipsing the dreams of childhood. It sounds like he was wrestling with this tension, this push-pull between, hard logic and maybe a deeper, more intuitive way of understanding the world. And that tension seems absolutely central to his whole architectural philosophy later on. What do you make of that early struggle?
Well, what's truly fascinating there is how Sullivan's personal journey kind of mirrors a much bigger intellectual struggle happening in society back then. That phrase, materialistic clarification of intellect, it really points to an era, the late 19th century, where science and engineering were just exploding.
Right, the Industrial Revolution in full swing.
Exactly. Powerful new ways to build, new materials like steel, the scientific method being applied to everything. It brought amazing clarity, no doubt. But Sullivan also sensed that this very clarity, this pure logic, it risked obscuring something deeper, maybe a spiritual or intuitive connection to design. He wasn't rejecting intellect, not at all. He was searching for something more than just functional logic. He wanted architecture that really resonated, that felt true on an artistic level, not just scientifically correct.
And that search for truth wasn't just, academic navel-gazing. He tells this story about being in Philadelphia, hearing Wagner's Vorspiel, third act, Lohengrin, at a concert. He said it was so fiery, so brand new, it startled him, kept him totally alert.
Wow.
Yeah, he saw it as pure genius, a revelation. And that tells us, I think, that he craved architecture that could hit you the same way, be just as honest, just as impactful, as daringly original as Wagner's music. Not just copying old styles. He wanted that brand new genius in buildings. He wanted them to sing, like Wagner, but in their own way, architecturally.
That deep appreciation for originality, for a building having its own unique voice, that's absolutely key to understanding Sullivan. It directly fueled his pushback against the dominant styles of his time, especially all that neoclassical imitation plastered all over American cities.
Yeah, banks looking like Greek temples.
Precisely. He saw it as fundamentally dishonest, just sticking historical forms onto things without any real connection to what the building was or where it was. And his famous protege, Frank Lloyd Wright, he echoed this later, even more strongly. Wright famously said he turned down European styles, preferring Sullivan's influence so he could maintain his own artistic vision. It wasn't just about taste as a philosophical stand against, well, architectural copying. A powerful call for an authentic, truly American architecture that grew out of its own context, its own function.
Which brings us right smack into the core of this deep dive. Form ever follows function. When Sullivan first said that, he was absolutely, positively not talking about those stark, plain utilitarian boxes that so many people mistakenly picture when they hear the phrase. That's the first big misconception we need to clear up. So, if it wasn't about stripping away ornament or demanding blandness, what was he actually getting at?
That is the central misunderstanding, you're right. For Sullivan, this was a statement about honesty, profound honesty. It was almost a spiritual, definitely an organic principle. His core belief was simple, but deep. A building's exterior, its appearance, its form, should be a direct, truthful expression of what's inside, its internal purpose, its structure.
So not just a pretty face.
Exactly. It wasn't about getting rid of beauty. It was about making sure the beauty emerged authentically from the building's inner life, its reason for being. The outside should tell you, eloquently, what's happening inside, how it's put together, what it's for, instead of hiding it behind some false front, some facade that tells a completely different story. Like imagine designing a grand opera house to look like a simple barn. That's the kind of architectural lie he was fighting against.
Okay, and here's where it gets really fascinating, where his whole organic approach snaps into focus and suddenly makes sense of why he used so much ornament, which seems contradictory at first glance.
Right.
Think about his buildings, those incredibly ornate, nature-inspired terracotta details, the swirling foliage, the intricate geometric patterns you see cladding his skyscrapers. To a lot of people, that just looks like decoration, right? Something extra added on. But for Sullivan, it is anything but arbitrary. He had this concept he called efflorescence, the flowering forth, or even the soul of the building. Can you unpack that a bit more? What did he mean by efflorescence, and how are these details for him actually integral to the building's function?
Oh, that's a great question. Because efflorescence is truly the key that unlocks Sullivan's unique genius. For him, these intricate details, they weren't just superficial decoration like wallpaper. They were an organic growth, a natural unfolding from the building's inherent purpose, like blossoms on a plant growing out of the stem.
Oh, okay.
He saw them as the authentic structural ornamentation, the building's inner spirit literally bursting forth, expressing its essence in its exterior form. So the form of the ornament followed the function of expressing the building's inner life, its unique identity, its connection perhaps to the natural world. It wasn't just pretty, it was deeply meaningful. It elevated the structure beyond just, walls and floors. It gave it a genuine soul. It was the absolute opposite of just tacking on historical bits and pieces.
So it's not decoration on the building, it's decoration as the building's authentic voice. Is that fair?
That's a perfect way to put it. Decoration is authentic expression.
Yes.
And he applied this revolutionary thinking to a totally new kind of building that was just emerging in his time, right?
Absolutely. He applied this principle with incredible clarity to the brand new challenge of the tall office building, the skyscraper. In his day, these were completely novel structures. They were popping up because of growing cities, booming economies, and crucially, new technology steel frame construction.
Right. The steel skeleton changed everything.
It did. These buildings were essentially vertical factories for commerce. A whole new type of building, a new typology. Traditional architectural styles just didn't fit these innovative steel frames or their stacked functions, shops on the ground floor, offices above, maybe executive suites at the top, plus all the elevators and services.
Yeah, how do you make a Greek temple 10 stories tall? Exactly. Sullivan's philosophy gave him a way to invent a new architectural language for these skyscrapers, one that honestly expressed their revolutionary steel cage structure, their soaring verticality, their complex commercial purpose. Instead of just forcing them into the mold of a classical temple or a Renaissance palace, which would have been, frankly, a lie, he let the form speak the truth of this new function.
Now, while Sullivan was hammering out these revolutionary ideas in late 19th century Chicago, he wasn't totally alone in thinking this way. His call for architectural honesty, for forms rooted in logic, well, it had some really interesting echoes, even direct precursors back in Europe centuries earlier. It's
Yeah.
almost like this idea was just waiting in the wings.
That's a really insightful way to put it. You could definitely trace a strong lineage back to figures like Eugène Viollet-le-Duc. He was a French architect and theorist, very influential, working decades before Sullivan.
Viollet-le-Duc, right. The
Yeah.
Gothic guy.
Well, yes and no. He was a free thinker. He wrote extensively about the constructive functionalism of Gothic architecture. But, and this was radical for his time, he analyzed it with no religious overtones. He wasn't romanticizing Gothic churches as mystical things. He was dissecting them, understanding their brilliant rational structural efficiency. He saw the flying buttresses, the pointed arches, the ribbed vaults, not primarily as symbols, but as ingenious engineering solutions to span large spaces and let in light.
And his critique of the architecture of his own time sounds incredibly similar to what Sullivan would later say about the neoclassical stuff in America. Viollet-le-Duc had this killer analogy. He argued basically, look, when we build machines, we give every part the exact strength and shape it needs, right? Nothing extra, nothing that doesn't serve a necessary function.
Makes sense.
But, he goes on, in our architecture, we just pile up forms we've grabbed from everywhere based on totally contradictory ideas, and we call that art. It's such a direct parallel to Sullivan's rejection of arbitrary forms, his call for honesty. He's essentially saying if we can be rational and functional with machines making every gear and lever perfectly formed for its job, why are we so irrational with our buildings? What was it about Gothic that he thought got it right?
It's a sharp point, and it reveals that core tension. Viollet-le-Duc saw Gothic as a triumph of intellect, a prime example of form truly following function. He admired how the practical appliances, the structural bits like vaults and buttresses, were refined to perfection. They led to a clear formula for structure that maximized height, light, and usable interior space. For him, even the decoration, which he sometimes called a servile and ultimately outre imitation of nature, was still fundamentally rooted in structural logic.
Even the gargoyles and stuff.
Yeah, even those. Though sometimes exaggerated, they usually had an underlying reason connected to the building's construction or its story. They drained water away from the walls, they depicted biblical narratives, or they visually expressed the structural forces at play in the stone itself. It was all integrated, not just stuck on for looks.
It's really striking how this desire for authentic expression keeps bubbling up through history. We see it with Viollet-le-Duc's focus on rational structure. But if we go even further back, centuries before him, right into the heart of the Italian Renaissance, we find Andrea Palladio. Now, his style, his aesthetic, might seem miles away from Sullivan's terracotta ornamentation.
Oh, completely different look, yeah.
But his work also shows this profound rationalism, this logic that really resonates with functional principles, even if he wasn't using that exact phrase. And what's really insightful here, I think, is how Palladio, centuries before Sullivan, shows us that function isn't just about, how the building stands up. It's also about its contextual performance, how it works in its specific place, and its visual storytelling, how it communicates its purpose and meaning to people, making the outside truly integral to the intended effect.
Absolutely. Palladio's approach, especially his sensitivity to the site and the building's role, offers clear parallels. Take his Palazzo Chiericati in Vicenza. It's this magnificent urban palace. He designed it as a Renaissance monument, understanding that it needed open space in front of it, a piazza, to be properly seen and appreciated.
You couldn't just cram it onto a narrow street.
Exactly. It has this grand two-story loggia, open colonnades, facing the piazza. He knew that this specific design, with its careful proportions and open elements, could not work in a narrow city street. It needed distance to be effective, to truly function as a public-facing statement. So the way people would experience it was a critical function dictating its form.
And he also had this amazing ability to let the exterior hint at what was going on inside, much like Sullivan advocated. You mentioned the Palazzo Valmarana.
Yes, another great example.
Apparently, the change in the outer bays is suggested by the plan. It corresponds to the more restricted dimensions of the interior spaces behind these bays. So the facade isn't just a flat, pretty pattern. It's almost like a subtle map of the internal layout. It expresses the inner workings outwardly. That's a very sophisticated kind of honesty, isn't it?
It is. And it's exactly that kind of detail that highlights his functional thinking. What's more, look at his use of giant pilasters, those massive flat columns at Palazzo Valmarana. He might have been inspired by Michelangelo's plans for St. Peter's, but he used these ancient forms expressively as effective forces. They weren't just symbolic nods to the past. They actively conveyed a sense of grandeur, strength, dignity, civic importance. This aligns perfectly with Sullivan's idea that ornamentation should carry real meaning, not just be decoration. Palladio also imposed this hierarchy of elements on his designs. A clear dominant center with subordinate parts flanking it. He applied this Renaissance order, even when studying ancient Roman buildings, sometimes imagining a system where form reflected a hierarchy of function, even if, as the sources suggest, the Romans themselves were often more casual in domestic planning than Palladio's idealized drawings might admit. His rationalism was about finding or imposing order and meaning.
And we can't really talk about Palladio without mentioning his big influence, Vitruvius, the ancient Roman architect and theorist.
The foundational text, absolutely.
Vitruvius pushed for U-style temples arranged on principles developed with a view to convenience, beauty, and strength. That classic trio. Function, aesthetics, structure, it's all there. And Vitruvius also noted how practical limitations like materials directly influenced form. He talked about aerostyles, temples where they had to use wood for the architraves, the beams over the columns.
Because wood couldn't span as far as stone.
Right, so these temples ended up being clumsy-roofed, low, broad. And then, interestingly, they were adorned with terracotta or gilt bronze statues. So you see how specific materials and the resulting structural limits shaped the building's form, and how decoration was then integrated in response. It's a clear historical precedent, millennia before Sullivan, for how resources and engineering sculpt appearance.
So you see this continuous thread, even way back in antiquity, this consideration of how decoration and structural honesty connect. Even in classical Greece, where arches and vaults were mostly kept hidden, treated as essentially utilitarian, there was still, apparently, some timid flirtation with the arch as a decorative element here and there. It shows an early, subtle tension between pure function and aesthetic form. It hints that architects have always been looking for ways to make the structural parts artistic, to give functional elements an expressive quality.
Then fast forward to the Renaissance again, and you find Philibert Delorme, a French architect who really embraced this idea of celebrating structure. He explicitly made a decorative feature of a portico structure, marking each stone course with special ornamentation.
Ah, that's fascinating.
Isn't it? It's a really interesting parallel to Sullivan's efflorescence. The structure isn't hidden or just doing its job quietly. It's highlighted, ornamented, becoming an integral, expressive part of the building's look. Delorme even included symbols commemorating the affliction of Catherine de' Medici, carved onto marble drums within the structure, showing how decoration could serve a deeply symbolic function woven right into the fabric and the story of the building. The structure itself tells a tale.
And this thinking wasn't limited to architects. Think about Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the giant of Victorian engineering.
The railway and bridge guy.
Exactly. When he designed the engine houses for his experimental atmospheric railway, he wasn't satisfied with just a purely functional box of a building. His notebooks show he devoted great pains to the design of engine houses, which he believed would not disfigure their setting. He looked at local building traditions, the landscape, the overall aesthetic impact. This engineer, thinking deeply about aesthetic integration, directly mirrors Sullivan's push for meaning beyond just stark utility. It shows that form and function were always intertwined in the minds of great builders, whether they called themselves architects or engineers. It wasn't about adding fluff, but about making the functional beautiful within its context.
Okay, so we've laid out Sullivan's original, quite nuanced idea, and we've traced its roots back through history. It's pretty clear that form ever follows function started as this profound call for architectural honesty, for integrity. But here's where the story takes a sharp turn. The phrase gets misinterpreted, twisted, really. It morphs into something much more rigid, leading to what we now think of as a more dogmatic, often quite stark kind of functionalism.
This shift is absolutely crucial to understand. In many cases, especially in the decades after Sullivan, appearance started to dictate function in problematic ways, or at least the pursuit of a certain look trumped genuine internal purpose. Take 18th century French houses, for instance.
Okay.
The sources describe how these grand homes often had no corridors. Think about that. Each room connected directly to the next, which meant, as the text says, all traffic, servants as well as guests pass through every single room to get anywhere else.
Zero privacy, basically.
Exactly. The priority given to appearances instead of to privacy is evident. They deliberately aligned doors enfilade, that straight line of sight through multiple rooms to create these impressive grand vistas. But it completely sacrificed personal space, comfort, and practical living. The form of the impressive vista dictated a highly inconvenient function for the people living there.
That's a perfect example of form messing up function. And Viollet-le-Duc, even before Sullivan, he was already railing against this kind of superficiality, this architectural pretense. He specifically slammed 16th century French chateaux, where the arrangements dictated by the requirements were completely out of harmony with the architectural appearance.
He had examples.
Oh, yeah. He points out one where the great gallery of the right wing presents outside the same features as the left wing, which contains only bedrooms and closets. So identical exteriors hiding totally different insides. Even worse, he notes the facade of the chapel is a repetition of the facade of the bathroom.
Wow, chapel and bathroom looking the same from the outside.
Exactly. It's arbitrary symmetry just for the sake of it, where unity means only uniformity, as he brilliantly put it. It's a total disconnect between what the building is and what it looks like. Precisely the kind of dishonesty Sullivan hated.
And this sets the stage for the rise of what many people think of as modern functionalism, often summed up by Le Corbusier's very famous, very provocative maxim, the house is a machine for living in.
Ah, yes, the machine for living.
This powerful and, let's face it, often stark interpretation really became emblematic of a new, more rigid kind of functionalism in the early 20th century. For Le Corbusier, the emphasis was heavily on efficiency. Optimizing space, light, air for people like a well-designed machine, his goal was to make the home a more efficient place to deal with everyday life rationally, prioritizing practical function almost above all else. But in this drive for machine-like efficiency, what Sullivan would have called the soul or the efflorescence of a building, that often got sidelined or even dismissed entirely as, unnecessary baggage.
So while both Sullivan and Le Corbusier cared deeply about function, Le Corbusier's take was much more reductive, much less, organic. You can really see this rigid, almost austere functionalism in action in big projects like Walter Gropius's Arn Lindenbaum housing estate in Frankfurt or Karl N's massive Karl-Marx-Hof in Vienna from the 1920s.
Huge projects.
Huge. And they were characterized by these long, parallel, low-rise slabs. It was a format the modernists loved because it was efficient ease of construction, and it supposedly reduced exposure to traffic for the apartments inside. These forms were undeniably driven by clear functions, often social or economic, like providing affordable, clean housing for many people. But they consciously stripped away the kind of organic ornament, the decorative elements that Sullivan saw as vital expressions of a building's inner life, its spirit. The form was purely rational, often quite bare, arguably without the poetry Sullivan sought.
And this contrast really highlights the fundamental difference between, say, Sullivan's idea of truly integrated expression and just arbitrary decoration, or even the deliberate lack of decoration as a statement. Think about the Gothic revival in the 19th century. Someone like Augustus Pugin, a real true believer, he asserted that the Roman Catholic Church is the only true one in which the grand and sublime style of architecture can ever be restored. For him, the Gothic form was inseparable from its religious function and meaning.
It meant something specific.
Deeply specific. Yet later, that same Gothic style was widely adopted without this specific religious affiliation for banks, universities, train stations. It shows how a powerful form could be completely divorced from its original profound function and just become, a stylistic choice, a surface treatment, rather than a deep expression.
And you see that superficiality criticized even in how materials were used, when they weren't used honestly. There's an example given about Oxburgh Hall's Gate Tower in England. It compares the genuine late medieval article with some early Victorian brickwork dressed with harsh-looking terracotta that was added later.
Harsh-looking.
Yeah. This harsh-looking terracotta was seen as just applied decoration, trying to mimic earlier, more authentic work, rather than something growing organically from the building's essence. It's exactly the kind of thing Sullivan would hate. And it reinforces Viollet-le-Duc's point that richness only acquires value by contrast and a judicious use of its resources. He contrasted that with just piling on accumulations of ornaments, gildings, and paintings, which, he said, almost invariably conceal poverty of design. In other words, if the decoration isn't meaningful and integrated, if it's just there to cover things up, it's actually a sign of bad design. It's dishonest. Okay, so we've journeyed through Sullivan's original vision, we've seen its echoes way back in history, and we've traced how the phrase got misinterpreted and applied much more rigidly. It's clearly got a complex past, but the big question now is, how has this principle, form follows function, evolved to handle the incredibly complex demands of our world right now? What does function even mean for architecture in the 21st century?
That is an excellent question. Because today, function in architecture, it's way beyond just basic utility or meeting a client's immediate program. It's become incredibly multi-layered. And often, it's dictated by a whole raft of regulations that simply didn't exist in Sullivan's time. Modern building codes, for example, they impose really strict functional requirements that directly shape architectural form, often in incredibly specific ways, right down to how a wall is put together.
Like what specifically? What kinds of codes actually force a building to look a certain way or be built a certain way? Can you give us some concrete examples?
Sure. Let's start with safety and performance, because those are not negotiable. Fire resistance ratings, for instance. Codes don't just suggest, they require specific materials and assemblies, combinations of materials for walls, floors, roofs, often dictating their thickness and exact composition.
So, like, how many layers of drywall?
Exactly. Or the type of insulation, the need for fire stopping between floors to prevent flame spreading. This influences everything. Then you have means of egress, how people get out safely in an emergency and accessible egress for people with disabilities. This profoundly shapes the layout of stairways, the width of corridors and doorways, the placement of exit signs, even the overall floor plan. These aren't stylistic choices, they are functional demands based on human safety, written into law.
Makes sense.
Also things like occupancy separation. If you have different uses in one building, say shops on the ground floor and apartments above the code, requires specific fire-rated barriers between them. This directly impacts how the building is compartmentalized inside, and that can definitely influence the external form or massing.
So a wall isn't just a wall anymore. Its thickness, its materials, its whole layered assembly is a direct response to a safety function mandated by code. It's almost like the building itself has to follow incredibly specific health and safety rules, just like a person does. I wonder if Sullivan could have possibly imagined this level of regulatory complexity.
Probably not. While he certainly championed honesty in construction, the sheer volume and detail of modern codes would likely be staggering to him. And it goes beyond just safety. Environmental control is now a huge functional aspect. Codes mandate technical functions like vapor retarders, layers within walls to prevent moisture buildup and condensation, which can lead to mold and rot.
Oh, right. Those are critical.
Critical. And they also ensure energy efficiency by controlling heat flow. You see specific requirements like all walls are to have a continuous water-resistive barrier attached over exterior wall sheathing, or specifying different classes of vapor retarders depending on the climate zone. These seemingly invisible layers directly affect how walls are designed, the materials chosen, the entire building envelope. Designers have to integrate these performance functions into the building's very fabric. The form follows the function of climate control and durability.
And what about the actual bones of the building? The structure itself? That seems like the purest expression of function, doesn't it? Where engineering dictates form.
Oh, absolutely. Structural engineering is, by its very nature, a pure expression of form following function. Every single element, from a massive steel beam to a slender concrete column, has its shape precisely determined by the forces it needs to resist gravity, wind, earthquakes. Concepts engineers use like moment of inertia, which basically measures a beam's resistance to bending, or section modulus, related to its strength against bending. These mathematical principles precisely determine the optimal shapes needed. Every curve, every dimension, is a direct functional requirement derived from physics.
No room for guesswork there.
None. Even the choice of materials, like specifying cinder concrete because it's an excellent fire-resistant material due to its porous structure, that's a functional decision impacting the building's form and substance. The structural engineer's job is to make sure the building stands up safely and efficiently, and that form is almost entirely dictated by the loads and forces it must handle.
That's definitely a fundamental level of functionalism. But function today, as you said, it's also pushed into totally new areas, especially with the urgency around climate change and sustainability.
Indeed. Sustainable design has profoundly redefined function. It now absolutely includes a building's entire environmental performance footprint. And this goes way beyond just using less energy. High-performance green buildings today aim for really holistic environmental goals. often guided by tough rating systems like LID Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, or the even more ambitious Living Building Challenge, the LBC.
The living building challenge, that sounds intense, like the building has to be alive.
It practically does. And these systems demand a level of performance that fundamentally reshapes architectural form. They really force a complete rethinking of what a building does, how it interacts with its site and the planet. The LBC has these mandatory prerequisites that are incredibly demanding, pushing way beyond simple efficiency.
Like what? What does a living building actually have to do?
Okay, get this. A building must be net zero energy, NZE. That means over a year, it has to produce as much energy, usually from renewables on-site like solar panels or maybe small wind turbines, as it consumes. Those solar panels obviously become a major part of the building's form, right on the roof or facade.
Right, very visible.
Then it demands net zero water, requires rainwater harvesting, treating and recycling gray water, super efficient plumbing. This directly shapes how roofs are designed to capture water, how internal systems process it, even the landscaping choices to minimize irrigation. And critically, it must be non-toxic. This means eliminating thousands of potentially harmful chemicals commonly found in building materials. This forces designers to rethink supply chains, choose natural or recycled materials. And it doesn't stop there. LBC buildings often have to provide for habitat restoration on sites and even incorporate urban agriculture. So the landscape around the building, or maybe the roof, becomes a functional ecosystem, producing food or supporting local wildlife. These aren't just nice add-ons. These new functions are so fundamental they demand radical shifts in form, materials, operations. The building itself becomes this living component of its environment.
Can you give us a real-world example? How does this translate into actual bricks and mortar or maybe solar panels and green roofs?
Sure. A great example is the Tyson Living Learning Center at Washington University in St. Louis. It was one of the very first projects to achieve full LBC certification. To meet net zero energy, the team had to make significant changes to the existing building they renovated. This involved things like adding insulation in several areas to drastically cut heat loss, installing high-performance retrofitted storm windows, and meticulously tuning the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning HVAC system. These are direct, physical changes to the building's form and its internal systems, all driven by the function of achieving net zero energy performance. Its skin and its mechanical organs were re-engineered for this critical new purpose.
And it's not just about energy and water and materials, right? It's also about how it feels inside. Indoor environmental quality, IEQ, that's a big part of modern function too, isn't it? How the building functions for the people using it.
Oh, absolutely critical. IEQ is now seen as a key functional goal, right up there with energy savings and ecology. It covers a whole range of factors affecting human health, comfort, and productivity inside buildings. Things like lighting quality, daylighting and exterior views, acoustics, noise and vibration control, and thermal comfort and control. The idea is that a truly functional building must also provide an optimal environment for its occupants. It moves beyond basic shelter to a much deeper, human-centered functionalism.
And the San Francisco Federal Building is often cited as a prime example of IEQ driving the form, isn't it? It sounds like the whole design was shaped by wanting good light and air.
It is, and it's a brilliant case study. The building's form follows its IEQ function to a remarkable degree. For instance, inside it uses mainly open-plan offices with low 52-inch high partitions. Why? To minimize the amount of light being blocked, letting daylight reach deeper into the space. And to get even more light bouncing around, the interior core areas, like meeting rooms, use clear glass panels instead of solid walls. But the most innovative part is probably the southeast facade of the main tower. It's covered with these perforated metal panels that rotate automatically to control light and provide unobstructed views. These panels actually track the sun throughout the day, adjusting the building's skin to optimize daylight, prevent glare, reduce heat gain, all while maintaining views out. It's a dynamic, active response where the building's exterior literally moves to provide comfort and visual quality form, actively following the function of IEQ.
Okay, so we've gone from basic utility and code compliance to environmental performance and human comfort. But function in architecture today also seems to cover the whole process, how buildings are designed, how they're built, even how they adapt over their long lifespan, especially with digital tools changing everything. It's about the function of the process itself, maybe.
You're absolutely right. Modern construction management, especially with the revolution brought by BIM building information modeling, has added a whole new layer to functionalism. BIM enables this really complex collaborative design-build approach. Interestingly, the source material notes this is the closest method we have to the master builder approach of old, where one entity oversaw everything.
Huh. Back to the future, kind of.
In a way, yes. This integrated process, facilitated by BIM, can be seen as a kind of form following the function of achieving efficient, coordinated project execution. The digital BIM model itself becomes this complex digital form that serves the function of streamlining the entire design and construction delivery process.
So BIM isn't just like fancy 3D drawings, it's about making the whole act of building more functional, more integrated. What exactly does it do that achieves that?
Precisely. It's way beyond just drawing. BIM leverages data incredibly effectively. It uses 3D parametric modeling, which means building components aren't just lines. They're intelligent objects with properties. If you change the size of a window, the wall opening adjusts automatically. Maybe even the structural calculations linked to it update. This captures design intent better and drastically reduces errors.
Okay, I see.
Then it offers clash detection. The software automatically checks if different systems interfere with each other, like is a plumbing pipe trying to run through the same space as an electrical conduit or a structural beam.
Yeah.
BIM finds these clashes before construction starts, saving huge amounts of time and money fixing problems on site.
That sounds incredibly useful.
It is. Then you have 4D schedules, which link the 3D model components to construction timelines. You can visually simulate the entire construction sequence, identifying potential bottlenecks or planning logistics more effectively. And even 5D cost management links the model elements to material quantities and costs, allowing for much more accurate and dynamic cost estimating throughout the design process. All these digital tools, these digital forms, serve the ultimate function of optimizing project planning and delivery, making sure the physical building can actually be built as efficiently and correctly as possible.
And part of that process involves something called constructability reviews, right?
Yeah.
Which sounds like a very practical check. Can we actually build this thing the way it's designed?
That's exactly what it is. Constructability reviews are a critical step today. Construction documents and BIM models are rigorously evaluated for clarity, consistency, completeness, and ease of construction. The goal is simply to make sure the form of the design is truly functional for the act of physical construction. It's about catching potential problems in the digital world before they become expensive rework and delays on the actual site. Making sure there's enough physical space to install a big piece of equipment or that a really complex connection detail can actually be assembled by the construction crew.
Now here's where it gets maybe even more philosophical about function. What about the idea that a building's real function isn't just what it does on day one, but how it performs, and crucially, how it adapts over its entire life? Because buildings, unlike most machines, stick around for a really long time.
Now you're touching on Stuart Brand's incredibly influential concept of adaptive buildings, often discussed through his idea of shearing layers. He argues that a truly functional building needs to allow for slippage between the differently paced systems that make it up. He identifies these layers: site, which is permanent; structure lasts centuries; skin, facade, roof maybe changes every 20, 30 years; services, HVAC, plumbing, electrical change every 7-15 years; space plan, interior walls, layouts change every 3 to 7 years; and stuff, furniture, decor changes constantly.
The shearing layers have changed.
Right, exactly. If you rigidly lock these layers together, say burying essential pipes and wires inside structural concrete, it may look efficient at first, but over time it is the opposite. Because you can't easily update or repair the faster-moving layers, like services, without destructively interfering with the slower layers, like structure. Brand contrasts, say, a maladaptive slab-on-grade foundation, where utilities are entombed in concrete, with an adaptive timber frame building, which often has accessible spaces like basements or crawl spaces, allowing structure, skin, and services to be separated and evolve independently. This is a much more sophisticated understanding of function over time. True long-term functionality requires built-in adaptability. Form needs to follow the function of future change.
And as we look even further ahead, function seems to be getting incredibly personalized, hyperlocal almost, thanks to new tech like digital fabrication. We seem to be swinging back from mass production towards something almost like individual craft, but with a digital assist.
Absolutely. The rise of digital fabrication tools with inaccessible community fab labs represents a really exciting new frontier for form follows function, bringing it right down to the individual or community scale. The big idea here is to empower people and communities to become globally connected for knowledge, but locally self-sufficient for production, making everything from food to furniture and from crafts to computers using shared digital design and manufacturing tools like 3D printers and laser cutters.
So instead of buying a generic, mass-produced thing, you could potentially design and make a bespoke solution for your specific need right there in your community.
Precisely. Fab Labs really embody user-centric design. They empower people to locally design and produce solutions to local problems, making technology feel localized, instrumental, and practical, not just something handed down from big corporations. This is perhaps the ultimate personalized functionalism. The form of an object or even a small building component directly responds to an individual or community-specific, immediate need or desire rather than a generic market assumption. Think about those Norwegian shepherds mentioned in the sources, using a local fab lab to create custom radio ID tags to track their sheep, a form directly following a very specific local function. It's about empowering people to be active designers of their own world.
And this connects to a concept called futurecraft, which sounds pretty futuristic. Can you paint a picture of how that might actually work in a city, connecting design and technology in this bottom-up way?
Futurecraft ties directly into how we might shape our urban spaces, making them more responsive and adaptable. It envisions using design as an operative mechanism for crowdsourcing the future based on mutation and selection, creating a real symbiosis between design and technology at the city scale. Imagine, say, a public plaza where residents can collectively propose, digitally design, and perhaps even fabricate adaptive elements using a local fab lab. Maybe benches that can be reconfigured for different events, streetlights that adjust based on real-time pedestrian flow or air quality data, or modular pop-up structures for farmers markets or community gatherings.
So the city itself becomes interactive.
Exactly. These user-generated designs could be prototyped, tested in place. The most successful mutations, the designs that best meet the community's evolving needs, get selected, refined, may be replicated. It creates this dynamic feedback loop where the urban form continuously follows an ever-evolving function defined by its users and the changing context. It's about creating an active interface between the digital design world and the physical built environment, where the city itself becomes a constantly adapting, user-influenced entity.
Wow, we have covered a lot of ground today. From Louis Sullivan's office in turn-of-the-century Chicago, back to ancient Greece and Renaissance Italy, and then all the way forward into these hyper-connected, sustainable, digitally fabricated, maybe even self-designing buildings of tomorrow. It's abundantly clear that form ever follows function is so much more than just a simple slogan or a command for bland boxes.
Indeed. It's really a philosophical lens, a way of understanding how buildings truly come alive, how they express their inherent purpose, their reason for being, and how they connect with us, hopefully, on a deeper, more authentic level. We saw how Sullivan's own early search for meaning, spurred by the fiery genius of Wagner and his rejection of just copying old styles, led him to champion this profound honesty in architecture, a truth that he felt should permeate every single aspect of a building's design.
And his concept of efflorescence, that's just so crucial here, isn't it? Those intricate, nature-inspired terracotta details weren't just slapped on. They were, for him, the authentic, structural ornamentation expressing the building's soul, its inner life literally flowering forth. In a world that often defaults to mass production and anonymous glass boxes, his idea really challenges us to seek deeper meaning, deeper connection in what we build. To understand that real beauty grows from real purpose.
Absolutely, and it shows us how this core idea has been picked up, adapted, and, sometimes fundamentally misunderstood throughout history. From Viollet-le-Duc's praise for the logical structure of Gothic cathedrals, to Palladio's rationalism shaping grand palaces based on context and hierarchy, then swinging towards Le Corbusier's machine-for-living aesthetic, which, while functional in one sense, definitely stripped away the organic soul that Sullivan prized.
Right.
And now we see it evolving again, grappling with the incredibly complex demands of sustainability, dense building codes, digital tools, user experience. Function itself keeps expanding. But at its heart, that pursuit of honest expression, of form, genuinely reflecting purpose in some way, that seems to remain constant.
Which means Sullivan's original intent, that deeper meaning, it remains a really powerful guide. Not necessarily for a specific style, but for creating truly authentic and meaningful architecture today. It pushes designers, builders, clients, all of us really, to look beyond just fleeting trends or superficial looks. To ask these fundamental questions: what is this building truly for? What are its materials honestly expressing? How does its structure work? What's its relationship to the people using it and the environment around it? It's about designing buildings that aren't just pretty, but are fundamentally truthful.
It really boils down to a call for integrity over imitation. It asks us to think about how our buildings could more genuinely express their internal workings, their true functions. Maybe it's through exposed structure that proudly shows how it stands up. Maybe it's through integrated environmental systems that reveal its ecological purpose. Maybe it's through human-centered spaces that clearly articulate their social function. It pushes us away from just applying arbitrary decoration or mimicking historical styles without grasping their original functional meaning. It's about creating buildings that truly belong to their time and place and tell their own honest, authentic story through their form.
So as you go about your day, maybe on your commute or just looking around your own neighborhood, take a moment. Look at the buildings around you, the big office towers, the houses, the schools, the shops, even your own home. And consider this. If form ever follows function, what function are our most celebrated buildings, or even just our everyday buildings, truly expressing today? Are they honest manifestations of their internal purpose, of the human life happening inside them? Are they reflecting the real demands of our environment, our society? Or are they maybe sometimes just well-dressed boxes, hiding their true selves behind a stylish but perhaps misleading facade? What story is your built environment telling you? And maybe more importantly, what story could it tell if form truly, deeply, and honestly followed function?
A powerful question to leave with.
That's all for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next time for another journey into the ideas shaping our world.